Welcome back, everybody. I think we've had the most wonderful start to this morning's sessions with the speech from the Minister, Senator Evans, and then a most stimulating and fascinating account of ways in which democracies are changing from Pratap Mehta. Now we're going to combine the next two sessions, which are on the topic of Australia and Indian political systems, looking at the way forward. So we're now looking into the future, and we're going to do this under the very capable hands of John McCarthy, who's going to chair both sessions as we've got combining them, and the much revered and respected foreign editor of The Australian, Greg Sheridan, will join the panel in the second session. Just like to give you a little bit of background about John McCarthy. He is the chair of the Australia-India Council and national president of the Australian Institute of International Affairs. He is one of Australia's most admired and effective diplomats. He served as Australia's ambassador in Vietnam, Mexico, Thailand, the United States, Indonesia, Japan, and from 2004 to 2009, he was the Australian High Commissioner in India. I've just had a word with Hamish MacDonald, who's one of our highly respected foreign correspondents, and said, "What would you say about John McCarthy?" And Hamish said, "John McCarthy is a renowned diplomatic troubleshooter." So I suggest he's a perfect person to chair these sessions. Over to you, John.
Thanks very much. Well, I will have the honour of introducing the panel in a minute, but I just might make some introductory comments. I'd just really briefly like to refer to what Amitabh has done in a very short period to get this institute going, because it needed a dynamic hand at the tiller, and he provided it, and in a remarkably short time. And so many congratulations. I think this gathering over the last couple of days and today testifies to what has been done by Amitabh here. Let me just talk very briefly about this session. Australia and India's political system and its political class, the way forward. Well, we've got members of the political class here. In India, the term political class is used a little bit more widely than Australia. I think in Australia, actual members of the political class get a bit embarrassed by the term, and it's not used quite so widely, but I think the meaning is pretty clear. But what I have asked members of the panel to look at is to envisage what they see as the main challenges within their own political spectrum over the next 5 or 6 years, and how those challenges should best be addressed, and leave it at that, and leave them the scope that they deserve to talk about what is most on their mind, because I think that will be instructive to all of us. In just looking at the agenda for this combined session, I'm impressed by a couple of things. First of all, the term political class. What actually does it mean, and what should we be thinking about? And I think to some degree that was touched on by Dr. Mehta's very, very informative lecture just before this session. But I think it is an issue, for both countries, because quite clearly the sorts of politicians that we have and where they come from is going to matter for the sort of democracy that we have in each of our countries, and the same for other democracies. And it's just looking casually, and because I don't regard myself particularly as a political scientist, 2 or 3 things struck me about India very forcibly when I was there. Firstly, the age of those that were the leaders in politics in India. Bearing in mind that in other countries where that same situation obtained, and I had in mind particularly China, Vietnam and Russia, steps had been taken in the preceding 2 generations really to lower the political age one way or the other. In Vietnam and China it could be done because the system so dictated. In Russia, I think it was it was beginning to happen anyway when Gorbachev came to power, but it evolved with the democratic system there. It hasn't yet in India, and as an outside observer, one couldn't help but think, really, we do have in this country to have people in their 50s and perhaps early 60s really running it nationwide. And I think that is something that is Indians themselves have become increasingly aware of. And I think, people of the eminence of Jay Panda, who is here today, suggests that people are very much aware of that requirement in India today. The second thing that strikes one about India, and it's not just India, but it is also countries like Japan, is the degree to which politicians come from political families. And that's, very, very noticeable. And it means, obviously, that it's a bit of a tradition. It's just like a business. It's a sort of family business. And to what degree should the pool for politicians be widened? But I say that's not just India. It is, in fact, evident with a number of countries. Now, coming back to Australia, I think there's another situation which I noticed as an Australian living in other political systems, for many, many years, is that coming back particularly this time, and others have commented on this, this is not an original, one is struck by the degree to which our political class have never done anything else. This is not by any means uniform, but you look at a situation whereby we have a very large number of very competent political technicians who do not necessarily represent, because of their experience, the country in the broadest sense. I think there was a situation 40 or 50 years ago where, people came out of the professions, they came out of business, they came out of unions, as they still do, but you got people who were across the spectrum in terms of their experience. That's no longer the case in Australia, and one is increasingly struck by people who really get into politics in their 20s and stay there. And it's like joining a business, like going off and becoming an accountant or a barrister. It's, where does it leave us as a country at the end of the day? Where does it leave our democracy? Even if you listen to interviews in Australia on the radio in the morning or on TV, people speak with sort of peculiar political language. It's not normal English. And it's a sort of, patty cake sort of thing that goes on back and forth. There's never such a thing as talking positively about the other side. It's all negative. But it's part of a political technician's instruction book. And perhaps it's time that, we evolved into being a country where the people at the top of the political system really came from really right across the country and all aspects of the country. Anyway, that's a personal thought. Great thing being about a retired public servant. When you retire, you can say anything, and it's good. Now, looking at, what I see as really positive about the interchange between political figures and journalists from India and Australia is that it really represents what we are endeavouring to do, and that is to get through to Asia in a more significant way than we have hitherto. Now, I don't want to be just another person referring to the Henry Report. I have mixed views on the Henry Report. Certain aspects of it were very positive. It has reflected the need for us to alter our economic settings to deal with Asia. But, we have these sort of political fads in Australia. We go through this from time to time. Bob Hawke talked about the clever country 25 years ago. Well, we kind of lost sight of that, but now we're talking about it again. That is an advantage of age. You see all these things that have happened before. Equally, in the 90s, we were told by John Howard that history and geography need not be incompatible. Well, they're not. But, we get these sorts of expressions from time to time. But I don't want to, damn with faint praise the Henry Report. It's certainly a very positive thing. But I think what really we have to understand as Australians is that there is a peculiar challenge for Australians in that we are a country with essentially a Western democratic tradition and essentially a European base. And I accept all that's been said about multiculturalism. Our primary foreign policy focus is on countries with different ethnic composition, different religion, different political traditions to ourselves. That puts us in a different position to most other countries like us. It makes us different from the Canadians, it makes us different from the Americans, it makes us different from the Europeans. And it is the primary challenge for Australian foreign policy and for Australia's place in the world as to how to deal with that. And it's commercial, it's political, but it is also cultural. And it is really crucial in that exercise that we understand how other countries think and how they work. And so these sorts of exchanges really, for us, are crucial. They are not a luxury. And that is the basic difference between being an Australian and being other countries that, in terms of ethnic composition, understanding, history and so on, are like us. And that's why this sort of event is so important. Now, I would, however, pause here. In traditional sort of diplomatic jargon, and I put within the category of diplomatic jargon terms like deepening and broadening our relationships. That's sort of, political speak. It doesn't really take you very far. But what you often hear is in these sorts of exchanges that we learn from each other. Well, we do in a sense, and I just want to qualify that. What I've noticed time and time again, coming back to Australia from overseas countries, is that the problems we face in this country are of a totally different dimension to the countries that surround us. I've always had a view, which is half flippant but half not, that if you live in Canada, Australia or New Zealand, you really don't have very many problems, so you have to invent them to keep the political class going. I mean, this is a country, of course we've got problems with water, of course we've got problems with the sort of terrain we have, a host of problems. But if you look at what we have, where we have 6 states and territories, a place like Tasmania, 300,000 people, you've got 2 houses of parliament, both paid. We sort of have to keep talking and have to keep, keeping ourselves busy about ourselves. But if you look at a country like India or a country like China or a country like Indonesia, the issues simply are of a different dimension. So I am always extremely hesitant when I hear people suggesting that Australian methods and Australian systems might be of assistance to countries to our north. Yes, to some degree, of course, but let's be careful. The other thing, though, which is, I think, particularly important about India, we do, from time to time, talk about what we have in common with India. That's same language, same democratic system applied to different countries. You don't want to underestimate that. It really is very important, because I've lived in India and I've lived in countries where you don't speak English and where you don't have the same democratic system, and there is a world of difference. For example, I don't think you would have heard a lecture of the sort and of the quality of Dr. Mehta's from too many other countries. I don't think you wouldn't have heard anything remotely like it in China or from a Chinese professor. You might be getting there with some Indonesians. But, to get that sort of level of comprehension of what is happening in India, talking the same language about the same issues, really is enormously important. I guess one other country you might get it from in the region, but here you run up against the problem of language, is Japan. The Japanese, these are people, after all, who have statistics about the number of people who die in their bath. So, they know that they can talk about social issues at great length, but doing it in the same language, talking to us in a way we can comprehend. That really is unusual. And so I think that's really, I think it's a remarkably important aspect of our relationship with India. Enough said on my part. It's nice to be a retired person giving vent to your prejudices and views, and I'll leave it at that. But let me just introduce the panellists whom I'm honoured to have with me. Professor Nandini Sundar, who's the Professor of Sociology at the School of Economics, Delhi School of Economics. Interestingly enough, she's done a lot of work on the tribals in India. And I had the pleasure of visiting an area on which she has done a considerable amount of work, and that is Bastar in the state of Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh. And her views and her scholarship are very highly regarded and very eminent in India. Secondly, Jay Panda, who is very interesting in the sense that he represents both the youthful side of politics in India, but also the importance of regional politics in India, which is a growing phenomenon. The importance of the really able chief ministers in India and the importance of regional views impacting on the centre to a greater degree than perhaps was the case earlier. Thirdly, Andrew Robb, who I've known for many years and for whom I have a very high regard as both a political observer and a politician of real note in the opposition. He's currently a Shadow Minister of Finance. And then Marsha Thompson, who is a former minister in the Victorian Labor government, Minister for Footscray, has taken a profound interest in India. I've met her on more than one occasion there. Her area of expertise is information and communications technology, and she was responsible for that under the former Victorian government. So all of you welcome, and I now leave it to you to give us your views in the broadest possible way. So, Nandini, why don't you start? Thanks a lot.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. McCarthy, and also Amitabh Mattu for inviting me here, and also everybody else at the Australia-India Institute. This has been a tremendously exciting conference. There's a lot of energy in the room, and I've really benefited a lot from being here, so thank you. Amitabh had asked me, in fact, they gave me the title India's Million Mutinies, so I'm kind of following orders. And I think Amitabh wanted me to kind of create a bust-up in the room, but I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to do that. It's also hard following Pratap's kind of grand sweep of the state of India's democracy, but one of the things that I want to do is to come at it from a slightly different direction and look at the sources of citizenship and democracy that we have in India today and where we're heading. And if you look at the kind of traditional 19th century model that the government is in fact promoting, which is a standard modernization theory, that industrialization is the basis for development, it leads to individualism, which leads to citizenship, which is the basis for social contract. Urbanization is good for equality because there's anonymity and equality as against village hierarchies, Ambedkar saying villages are the den of casteism, etc. So for instance, this is just one quote from Mr. Chidambaram saying that, even if you give rights to people in the forest, the main thing is to get them out of the forest, get them industrialized, get them into the cities. And clearly there's a danger from importing this model because for several reasons. Firstly, a lot of work is showing that it was never really applicable even to Western Europe because levels of urbanization, the number of nuclear households, etc., simply did not match this model of atomization, individualism, equality, right up to World War II. There's also a lot of revisionist history on how, rather than the Industrial Revolution, what really propelled growth was the Industrialist Revolution, an increase in domestic industry, which led to a growth in demand and therefore led to increase in growth. Unlike Europe at that time, people do not have access to colonies anymore, certainly not third world countries which are trying to modernize. And the ecological constraints of the 21st century, most importantly, are very different from those of the 19th and early 20th century. So when you look at what the sources of citizenship in India might be, work no longer seems to be the main source of meaningful citizenship. I mean, if you look at the standard Western model, especially the post-Fordist model, the Fordist model of the immediate post-World War II period, people were engaged with the state because they had high employment, they had expected benefits from the state, they paid taxes to the state. And that's clearly not something that one is going to see replicated in most of the developing world. And it's increasingly not available even in advanced capitalist countries. In India, 90% of the jobs are in the informal sector. Of the formal sector, only two-thirds is in government. And there's a very high correlation between caste and formal employment. And the way in which most of the unorganized urban poor get employment is through patronage, private networks, etc. So what you have in India is several contradictions that make the form of Indian citizenship particularly exciting and also complex. As one of the speakers pointed out yesterday, as Ambedkar had said, we have a combination of universal suffrage and social and economic inequality, which creates a particular kind of political impetus. You have a coalescing of stages of early industrialization, primitive accumulation, and a late knowledge economy. You have a media which you didn't have in the early stages of industrialization, which is creating new imagined communities around the nation, and at the same time encouraging regionalism. So one of my favorite examples is this television program called Indian Idol, where passions run high over whether a Bengali or an Assamese wins the Indian Idol, but at the same time, it's called Indian Idol. So there is a sense that the form of Indian nationhood is not something that is opposed to regionalism, but is something that is mediated through regionalism and particular identities. And I think that's something that we really need to grasp as important, that diversity is not something that needs to be overcome or that is a source of tension in India, but it's actually the source of Indian nationalism. What worries me is also a growing tension between formal equality and diversity. For instance, as Rohini was talking about, the whole affirmative action and reservations issue in India. And there is a serious danger that the sort of emphasis on reservations in the formal sector, in employment and education, is actually taking away from a larger dialogue on universal access, and particularly about forms of knowledge. So, for instance, social justice is about how many Dalit students you might have in an agricultural university. It's not about what that agricultural university is teaching, the fact that we have 70,000 varieties of rice in India, and that kind of knowledge is getting lost through the formal sector, through formal educational institutions. So the arguments that we need to have are about the place of conflict, the shape of inequality, the value of diversity, forms of democracy. And, if you look at, I'll just emphasize a couple. I'm going to talk about the value of conflict. If you look at, say, the World Bank report in 2011 on conflict and development, there is this usual standard narrative about conflict being bad for development, pulling down the GDP, etc. But if you look at development, in fact, what it means, it is an intrinsically conflictual process. And in fact, none of this, it's important to realize that it's not necessary, in fact, to resolve this conflict, and conflict is something that actually does lead to empowerment and assertion, etc. And business as usual, the lack of conflict is often a very violent situation in itself. When we talk about equality, again, there are complexities to deal with in terms of the relationship between social equality and economic inequality, whether they're proceeding in tandem. And one of the things that we see increasingly in India is the unequal right to have emotions. So, for instance, some people, the more powerful you get, the more you can claim hurt sentiments, the more you can claim anger. In fact, if you look at the media, there's all this stuff about road rage, and road rage is something almost, the fact that we've arrived with road rage as you have in America. But when you talk about the poor being angry, there is a sense that, old models of deference are breaking down. How come people are taking to insurgency? I mean, this is seen as something that is a problem rather than seeing the right to be angry as a universally equal right that we should have. Similarly, the right to be, this sense of what patriotism is again an unequal right. So, flag waving, cricket nationalism is seen as patriotism, whereas Irom Sharmila, who's been fasting for 12 years in order to save democracy against the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, is in jail and is seen as a problem. Again, in terms of the dangers of our democracy, inequality is, of course, one thing, but and the sort of emphasis on procedural democracy. But the presence of a free media, while it's very important for democracy, is also extremely dangerous, because when the media doesn't cover things, the argument is, well, if it was important, if it had happened, the media would have reported it. And I know from personal experience from Chhattisgarh, when hundreds and thousands of villages were being burnt and thousands of people were being killed, there were 5 articles in the national media in the whole of the first year of this tragedy. And when you brought it to people's attention, they said, but it can't be happening. We haven't read about it in the media. So if you look at all the sort of million mutinies, you have land wars, police firings as a way of dealing with people protesting against displacement, caste wars, state-sponsored communalism, and a number of insurgencies in different parts of the country. Kashmir, Mizoram, large parts of the country are, in fact, in states of insurgency. One of the things that I think India and Australia have in common is the way they have treated their Aboriginal people and Adivasis in India. And I have to say that the Australian treatment is far worse than anything that we've had in India. I mean, there is absolutely no comparison between the way Aboriginals have been treated in Australia and in India. But at the same time, you see certain commonalities in terms of the way Indigenous people across the world are treated in terms of denial of land rights, schooling not seen as an avenue towards empowerment, but as a civilizational tool, and incarceration, which is a sure sign of subalternity all across the world. How not to fight Naxalism? I see Mr. Narayanan smiling at me because he was one of the architects, I think, of this policy of creating vigilantes to take on the Maoists. And what it has done is lead to increased support for the Maoists to a scale which was, certainly not visible before. And now you have Operation Green Hunt continuing. This, unlike Pratap's wicked problems, I don't think that reconciliation or peace is actually a wicked problem. I think it's actually a very simple issue. There's no great rocket science in trying to understand where we need to go. I mean, there are 2 paths that we can take. One is continued repression, kill off everybody, and which is what we have done in Punjab very successfully. In Mizoram, 83% of the population was relocated. You could just do it and leave lasting scars. Or you could do it in a way that follows the Constitution. And I think the single most important thing that we can do to address these million mutinies is, in fact, uphold the rule of law and the Constitution. There are plenty of models across the world of truth and reconciliation commissions. In Colombia, right now, you have dialogue going on between the FARC and the government, criminal prosecution of those involved. And I just want to end by saying that I've come up with my own version of the Australian apology that Prime Minister Kevin Rudd gave to the Aboriginal people of Australia, which I think would be a start to, at least for the Indian government, to recognize the harms that have been done. And one of the things that I would ask the government to apologize for is not changing the colonial laws so that we still have the old penal system, the old forest laws, the old Land Acquisition Act, and to actually lay claim to a future where everybody is an equal partner in a variety of different aspirations. Thank you. How do I put this on?
Thank you very much indeed, Nandini, for that really a very profound and interesting account of the issues in relation particularly to tribals. And I'm sure we'll have some questions later on, particularly on your views on our treatment of Aboriginals, which is a very pertinent question. Jay.
Thank you. My favorite anecdote is actually a true story, but is also probably reflective of how many Indians feel about politicians. A few years ago, my then 12-year-old niece had to write an essay for school on politics, and she came and asked me for advice. I should have just told her, given her the usual spiel about national service and all that, but I made the cardinal mistake of telling her that she was old enough and that she could look it up on the internet. So she came back to me gleefully and said, "Uncle, I found out that politics is not one word but two. Poly is Latin for many, and ticks, of course, are small, blood-sucking insects." I'll touch upon this and the current mood in Indian politics in a few minutes. I'm often asked why Indian politics has fragmented. Why are there so many parties? Why more than 40 parties in parliament? Why coalitions, and are they bad for the country? I like to use the example of Europe, similar size in terms of numbers of languages, much more population than Europe, subnationalities. And I asked them, can you imagine Angela Merkel campaigning for votes in Greece? Or Silvio Berlusconi in Norway? It's a natural condition that a country of continental proportions and this much diversity should actually have this kind of representation. 65 years ago, when the existence of India was in danger, and there was a party which had led the freedom movement, I think it made sense for all Indians to put their faith in one party to run the country. Today, things are different. The existence of India is secure. Giving rise to regional aspirations or other aspirations are not a threat to the existence or the idea of India. None of these regional parties wants to leave India anymore. That might have been true in the 60s or the early 70s. So we find a way to naturally express our aspirations without actually threatening the idea of India, and which is why I think regional parties flourish. Coalitions have actually existed for all of the last 2 decades. Some people think it's a feature of the last 7 or 8 years. Every single government since 1991 is a coalition. 2 or 3 coalitions have been led well. Narasimha Rao, who had almost a majority but needed outside help. Vajpayee. These were people that transcended their times, and they adapted to the new era of coalitions very well. I think the problem we have today is that by and large, the top leadership of the political parties today at the national level in India are people who cut their teeth in the pre-coalition era. They are not used to the give and take that is necessary to get their agenda through. My experience with Vajpayee was that there was give and take every day, every morning, every afternoon, every evening, and he managed to get through perhaps 60% of the agenda that they had, quite unlike the deadlock we've seen. And I believe, I'm optimistic, that with a generational change, there is going to be a larger number of leaders who can actually make or push their agenda through, despite having to run coalition governments. In fact, in the recent cabinet reshuffle, you've had a few younger ministers who've explicitly stated this. Just last week, they've explicitly stated that we believe in engaging with allies, with opposition, and to work out feasible legislation. Politics in India was long dominated by social justice issues, for example, caste, for decades. But over the last decade, there has been a gradual but perceptible shift to governance-related issues. It doesn't mean that issues like caste are over, but let me give you an example. The 90s were the decade when caste dominated politics, when caste-based parties were very shrill in the rhetoric that they used. And I think that peaked about 98 or 99. If you look at the campaigns in 98 or 99, certain political parties had extremely shrill caste-based political rhetoric, campaign rhetoric. That gave way to realizing that that vote had plateaued and that they needed to broad base. And the very same political parties, at the end of by the 99 election and thereafter, had toned down that shrillness and had tried to appeal to a much broader cross-section of voters. The shift to governance has also happened simultaneously with the breaking of another convention, which was anti-incumbency. During the process of fragmentation of Indian politics from the late 60s till the late 90s, you developed this system of anti-incumbency where only 2 out of every 5 elected representatives were likely to get re-elected. Very different from countries like Western democracies. But the regional parties that Pratap Bhanu Mehta and others have been referring to, some of them, about half a dozen of them, have been led by charismatic leaders who have broken this trend. They have changed the narrative from earlier narratives to the narrative of governance and have actually delivered better economic performance than the rest of the country over the past decade. If you look at states like Odisha, mine, Bihar, Chhattisgarh, Gujarat, a couple of others, some of these states were considered basket cases, but they've broken that mold. They've come out, they've given better economic performance than the nation as a whole. And this is unprecedented for many, many decades. And in some cases, in Odisha, for many centuries. And these are the regions that have broken anti-incumbency. And although I think Pratap made a superb presentation, the one thing I'll disagree with him was that he said that these have a limit of maybe 1 or 2 terms. We are well set to win our 4th term, and I believe some of these other parties are well set to win their 3rd or also 4th terms. And that is because although they may not have decentralized below the state level, as Pratap pointed out, the fact of regional empowerment has meant decentralization from Delhi, which itself is a very big movement that has enough momentum to carry on for quite some time more. The big question is, why aren't 1 or 2 of the national parties emulating these regional successes in changing the narrative at the national level to governance? Because some of these regional successes are actually from regional leaders of national parties. But that is the big question, and I'm not sure whether it will get answered in this election or the next one, but it will get answered in the very near future, because we see that trend happening in the rest of the country. And the party that figures it out first, as Pratap said in his last presentation, I think will be the big gainer that can dominate Indian politics for quite some time. About the political class, enough has been said by many earlier speakers. I'd just like to point out that in his very interesting book, India, a Portrait, Patrick French did some statistical analysis a couple of years ago and came out with the fact that not a single member of parliament below the age of 30 comes from outside a political family. Every single MP below the age of 30 comes from a political dynasty. And that the vast majority of MPs below the age of 50, probably 75%, come from political families. Very different from the early years of the Indian Republic. And this closed system also needs to change. So something needs to give. But something else also needs to give in the system, not just the class. Because endorsing a little bit about what Nandini Sundar was just saying about colonial laws, it shocks many people when I point out that some of our parliamentary rules were actually enacted before independence, and we just carried them over. And these rules were implemented in 1919 and 1935 in the Government of India Act and other acts, which were designed to give a platform for the natives to vent some steam, but not to actually have real power, which was reserved with the viceroy. Let me give you 3 examples. Did you know that the government actually has a veto on what can be discussed in Parliament? Yeah, we do. You can have discussions without a vote that don't have a veto. But a discussion under Section 184, where people get to vote a motion where you can censure the government, not a confidence motion, but a censure, requires government concurrence. This has to go. This has to go. I have been advocating, many others have been advocating, that a substantial minority of MPs should be able to insist on a 184 motion, a voting motion. My proposal is 33%. Some people have said 25%. We need to have rules-based systems. Did you know that a private member's bill, if I file a bill, it needs to be vetted by the government before it is introduced? It made sense in the era of the Raj. Doesn't make sense anymore. It has to go. The whips have become extremely important to keep politicians in line. So I could go on a lot about the reforms that are necessary, but the three things I think I summarize the three top priorities I would have is this significant minority for rules-based voting motions rather than a government concurrence. Also to provide stability to government, change our system of confidence to the German system. Now, instead of having a no-confidence motion, the German system would have an alternate affirmation of confidence in a different leader. Now, the difference is, today when you have a no-confidence motion, half a dozen potential prime ministers love to muddy the waters. But if you name one alternate, then people either coalesce with him or her or against him or her, and that provides a lot more stability to the government. And I think the whip ought to be removed for everything except confidence motions and money bills to enable the government to function. Everything else ought to be at the conscience of the Member of Parliament. I have a few other things, but I'm going to wrap up because of the time constraint. I'll just end by saying that there are immense parallels between the India of today and the US of between 100 and 130 years ago. Several people have commented on this. I've written several op-eds about this. The last 30 years of the 19th century saw a phenomenal change in the US, and that was called the Gilded Age, when it had enormous economic growth, enormous corruption, and it transformed from an agricultural country to an industrialized country of mostly middle-class people. We are witnessing something very similar: enormous growth, enormous corruption, a lot more industrialization. But what followed from the Gilded Age was the progressive era, where the US made very significant changes. Some of these changes are actually being debated in India today, and I think we are sort of struggling to shift gears into a progressive era where we can make these changes. I will end in 1 minute just highlighting some of these things. In the late 19th century, US politics was also very cabal-oriented, very backroom. Political parties were not democratized. Decisions were made in the backroom, and the public had very little say in it. For example, in the choice of candidates, very similar to how it happens in India today. Candidates are chosen in the back rooms of parties. There are no primaries. So the primary system, which was introduced during this change, also led, I'll give you one very significant example. The Senate used to be one such example, where senators, just like India today in the upper house, senators were elected from the state assemblies. And essentially, they were party nominations, so they were backroom deals, exactly how it happens in India today. But in 1913, the US passed the 17th Amendment to the Constitution, making the Senate a direct election. What that did was it bust the Tammany Hall type of party politics. And anybody who aimed to be a senator could not just fix backroom deals or appeal to one group of voters, had to appeal to the entire state. And thus it created centrist politicians who could cater to the entire state's aspirations at the national level. We need such changes. My final comment is, the activism that is going on in India today reminds me of something that de Gaulle is supposed to have said. He said, "Politics is too important to leave to the politicians." Many activists think the same in India today. I think they're partly right, but I think we need to co-opt such people into politics. We also need to reform politics in some of the ways that many of us have been talking about in this past day and a half. And I think in the next 5 years, whether we have one election or two, I think we're going to see, perforce, some of these changes begin to happen. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jay. You showed that you're very far from being complacent about your own system. And we look forward to your influence on Indian politics in the years to come. Andrew, great pleasure to hear you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, John, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's nice to be able to step back from the competitive nature and format of the House of Representatives and to come and reflect on what has contributed to the great success of our country over 200 years at least. I'd just like to say that for many people, we're seen as the lucky country. In fact, it's been a description coined by historians about Australia's first 200 years. And it is true that we are truly blessed as a country. And I do think it's worth, though, reflecting on the nature of and those factors that have contributed to success. It's just like with an individual who can be born with great talents and great opportunities, but how many of those people have you gone through university with or working life who have never really made the most of those talents and those opportunities? And I think it's true for Australia in many respects. You do make your own luck in life. If you do have talents and endowments to start with, you're better placed to be hugely successful. But people often with less talents and less endowments do find that they are enormously successful because of application, because of the way they go about their life. I think it's just as true for a country. Back at the start of the 20th century, Australia and Argentina were both very similar in terms of the level of and quality of life and the wealth per individual. The endowments as countries, very similar characteristics as countries, and we were up near the top of the wealthy and fortunate countries in the world. Yet Argentina has not made the most of those endowments and those opportunities. And Australia, I think, has been remarkably successful. The form of democracy that we've got and the history we've had, the short history we've had so far, has been remarkably successful. And I think it's true too when you look at East Germany and West Germany. Over an even shorter period of time than the Argentinian-Australian comparison, you could see two countries, two halves of the same country, and you look at what happened from the 1940s through until the end of the 1980s, and the fortunes and the outcomes and the quality of life and all of the rest fundamentally different. And what it does show you, I think, is that in a most profound way, in that respect, that philosophy does matter and systems do matter. In fact, in the space of a short 50 years, it can fundamentally alter the lives and the fortunes of literally millions of people in almost identical circumstances to start with. So what I'd like to do in the few minutes I've got is just reflect on one or two contributing factors, I think, to the success that we've enjoyed to date. We've had plenty of failures, but in the scheme of things, I measure success on outcomes. And if you look at the quality of life that we enjoy, you would have to conclude that there has been a large measure of success in Australia over the last 100 or 200 years. And I'd just like to reflect on one or two factors. Success, as with any organisation or individual, usually success has 1,000 fathers, and it's true, it does. But what are one or two things that have helped drive our success, which we must be particularly alert to protecting as we go forward? Because as with East and West Germany, you can see how things can fall off the rails so very quickly if you don't treasure, if you don't honour, and if you don't respect the things that have given you the success that you might have had. And there's two factors that I'd like to look at. One cultural and one more structural, as I say, amongst many other factors that have no doubt contributed to our success. And the first is the cultural strength, the cultural facet which I think is underpinned the dynamism and the focus, especially of our politicians. And the great strength, I think, has been the healthy cynicism and the sense of self-worth of the majority of Australians. It's hard to define how that arrived. I think in many respects it runs through our culture, I suspect because of the early Irish Catholic influence. There is an irreverence, a healthy irreverence towards authority in Australia. Doesn't mean people blatantly violate the law, but there is a healthy irreverence towards people in authority. They don't see those people as greatly above them. They don't see them, they see them as people with a job to do, an important responsibility. There is a respect, I find there's a respect, but there is a healthy irreverence towards figures of authority. And I do feel that that sort of, that cynicism has put a check on the potential for the abuse or for arrogance to manifest itself over a long period of time within our political process, or for figures of authority to overreach their position, as their position overreach their authority in what they do in governing. I'd give you two classic examples just in recent history, which I think you could find many of if you go further back. Our Prime Minister, who lost office in '96, Paul Keating, had strode the national stage and been a very successful politician in terms of lots of reforms. In 1993, as Prime Minister, he won the unwinnable election. I know because I was the campaign director for the team that lost the unlosable election. That's where I got my twitch from. But I could talk for hours about why we lost, but I don't want to. But Paul Keating won the unwinnable election. The trouble, I think, for Paul was he interpreted the result the wrong way, as though it wasn't a vote for him. He did a magnificent job winning the election, but it was a licence to go and govern for another 3 years till the next election. But in many respects, you got the impression in the next 3 years that the Prime Minister, Paul Keating, began to believe that he knew best. He stopped listening in lots of ways, and just 3 years later, after winning the unwinnable election and having done a lot, I think, for Australia in the years before, he lost and we had the biggest victory in our history. And I think it was people saying, we can support this person when he's fighting hard and listening. If he gets arrogant, we can move away just as quickly. And on the other side of politics, subsequently, John Howard, a recent Prime Minister, 11.5 years, second longest serving Prime Minister. But there was a sense towards the end of his term that he perhaps overreached the authority that was being given to him in a policy sense. And the Prime Minister lost his seat, lost his own seat. It's quite a profound political outcome. And yet both men, Paul Keating and John Howard, remain as highly respected former Prime Ministers. So there is a respect, there's an ongoing engagement with those two men. They are listened to by the community on what they say and what they think, and they'll be seen as great figures in our political history. And yet that sense of irreverence, as soon as people thought that their time was up, they went. And it's been a great discipline on politics in Australia, and it's as much a cultural thing as it is a system thing. The second measure, which I think has contributed to our success and is not, I don't think, well articulated by lots of the political class for for different reasons, is that I feel that the federalist nature of our country has been a most potent in history over time, was the most potent, one of the most potent contributing factors towards our success. Often we hear the term the tyranny of distance, especially as it is applied to Australia. Here we are, a continent as big as the United States, and yet we've got 22 million people, and we are spread not much in the middle, but to the four corners of the rest of the country. But in many ways, I feel it was a driver of our success, is because it meant that the states and the communities, the far-flung communities, had the responsibility to make decisions about their communities, their institutions, the way in which they ran their lives and their businesses. They were forced to because of the fact that they were not connected as closely or as effectively as communities might be in other countries. And having spent 20 years of my professional career running federalist organisations, firstly the National Farmers Federation, which took me all over the country, and then running the Liberal Party, which was a collection of autonomous state organisations, again taking me to many communities all over the country over 20 years. I became, over that time, a very committed federalist. In fact, I came to understand and to observe, more importantly, to see that the decisions and what works in a place like Albany, in the southwest corner of Western Australia, invariably is quite different to what would work in a city like Cairns, in the north-east corner of Australia. And that was true right across the country. And I do feel that over the last 25 years, the biggest threat to our success as a country and to perpetuating the lucky country outcomes has been a very serious push and trend to centralisation. And it's a more recent phenomena. And I feel, in many respects, if we're looking to the future and what do we need to do to protect the success of our democracy, it is to reverse this quite serious trend towards nationalisation and centralisation. And I do think that at a philosophical level, we are great proponents in Australia of the capitalist system. And as I go back to the German experience, you do see the results of a capitalist system versus a centrally dictated system in the most starkest fashion. And yet here we are in Australia increasingly, over the last 25 years, heading with the political class, demanding common standards across the country, demanding and having 80% of all of the income dictated from Canberra. And to me, in my view, it is progressively taking us towards a centralist route, albeit at a bureaucratic and political level, and away from the great strengths, which was the inherent dynamism of competition, rather than endless consensus and standardisation. So I'll leave you with that thought, and thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you also for making comments which are of, I think, particular relevance also to our Indian friends. Marsha, please. Thank you.
Okay. I hope you can see me over the podium. I've worn my highest heels in order to be able to do this today. Can I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, their elders, both past and present? I think it is important to acknowledge them at these sorts of events. I also want to pay my respects to the Australia-India Institute This is an amazing conference, and I've been fortunate enough to be able to sit in on a number of sessions, and it truly is the argumentative Indian. And I think it's an important topic for many reasons, because I do think that we are now in a state where we trivialise our politics. And I want to start with a quote from a former Prime Minister, Bob Hawke. Bob Hawke said, "The essence of power is the knowledge that what you do is going to have an effect, not just an immediate, but perhaps a lifelong effect on the happiness and well-being of millions of people. And so I think the essence of power is to be conscious of what it can mean for others." And I think that's a responsibility that we, as members of parliament, have to take with us every day that we are members of parliament. We are temporary custodians of our parliamentary system. We have a responsibility to pass it on in good health and in good condition to the next generation that follows us. Now, I did a little bit of a comparison, and listening to the discussions through the last couple of days, there are some great similarities between India and Australia. Your problems in India, for those of you who have come from India, are enormous, but they are not dissimilar to the same problems that we face here. They might be minuscule in our context. You talk about infrastructure, and it is vitally important in India. Whether it's water infrastructure, road infrastructure, education infrastructure, we talk about exactly those same things here. Yes, we might be in a better position, and we only have 22 million people to cater for in a growing population, but they are still the very same issues that we all confront. We talk about the issues of multiculturalism. Well, we are a multicultural country as well. Over 200 different countries are represented here. Over 180 languages are spoken in Australia, and 110 faiths are followed in this country. So we are a very multicultural country, and has been discussed, I think John McCarthy raised, that we are traditionally a European country with European values, a Westminster system of parliament, which you too share in India. We have that, but we have a changing population. We have now more people after the 2011 census declaring that they come from non-English speaking backgrounds. I am a first-generation Australian. So we are a very interesting melting pot, and so is India. And that diversity has to be accounted for. But I want to go back to my essential point about trivialisation, because I think it's very important. I think it's very important that we discuss the discourse now that we have in politics, because I think that's one of our major challenges. How we move away from discussing the fact that Julia Gillard, the Prime Minister of Australia, falls over in India, rather than discuss the actual issues that were raised on that visit to India, is so crucially important. How we can trivialise our political system and therefore make it irrelevant for a generation coming through. These are crucially important things that we need to decide. So when John McCarthy says, what are the challenges we face? Yes, we face the challenge of climate change, but the globe faces that challenge. And our political leaders must find the way through to meet those challenges. We all have an interest in meeting the challenges of poverty. The poverty in India, to me, is overwhelming. But here in Australia, we have our own levels of poverty. We have our own levels of disadvantage, and we have our own levels of people who have no voice. And as political leaders, we have a responsibility to meet that need. And those challenges are immense. They are immense for us, even though we only represent 22 million people. And I thank God that I'm not a member of Parliament in India trying to meet the challenges that you have to meet in India, because I think they are incredibly difficult. But at least now you are having that intense dialogue. You are looking at the mechanisms. But I'll put the challenge back onto you. When you talk about, and there has been a lot of talk about in this conference about corruption, about a political class. By the way, I don't identify with any political class. Talk about a political class, talk about a dynasty of politicians, when you talk about all that is wrong, one of the things that we teach our children, and we do often, is to reinforce the good things that they do. We tell them, you've done that really well, in the hope that we guide them to do the right thing. Well, you need to do that with your politicians too, and your judges, and your policemen, and all of those who take responsibility, your doctors, your nurses. Reinforce the positive as you are critical, because you want to give the example of what is good and what is successful. So yesterday I went away with a bit of despair after listening to some of the sessions yesterday about how bad things might be in India. But there was reference that there are good things too, and they are the things that you must hold on to as well, as we must do in Australia. We can do things very well as politicians, and as Andrew Robb said, we can also stuff them up. And I'll give you some examples, because I've got two in my former portfolio. Excuse me while I pick up my glasses. We were the accidental government in 1999. We weren't expected to be elected, and we were. And I was very fortunate to become a minister in that government, and one of my portfolio areas of responsibility was the Minister for Small Business. And I have two stories, one of success and one of failure, and I'll tell you about the failure. It was very early on, within the first 3 months. We have a workers' compensation scheme here called WorkCover that employers invest in to protect their workers and insure them from injury in the workplace. And we decided that we would increase the amount that employers had to contribute to that scheme in order to make changes to the scheme to benefit those workers and what they would get in case of injury. What we didn't know was that the WorkCover Authority, which is a separate authority, was also going to change the industrial classifications for a whole lot of businesses at the same time. And we discovered that that meant for a whole lot of employers, their WorkCover bills went through the roof, not just because of us, but also because of the reclassification that we weren't warned about. Now, as a small business minister, this is the last thing you want to hear, is that you're going to have a whole lot of small businesses up in arms with bills that they cannot afford to pay. And the way we found out about it was my Chief of Staff at the time was, in fact, a small businessman. And he brought his WorkCover bill into my office. And we looked at it and we go, oh my God, this is a disaster. So we ran straight to the Premier's office, because we had a very accessible Premier, and said, we've got to do something about this. That was a rearguard action. It was a problem partially created by us, partially created because we were a new government and were not aware of changes that were already going to be put in place by an authority independent to government. And it was going to have incredible impact on small businesses. And we were able to put some steps in place, not to change what we did, but to modify it and to help and assist small businesses through that transition. And then there's the proactive thing that you can do. And the proactive is to actually engage with the community you represent. And I think that's where all MPs have to be absolutely resolute to do. Engage not just with your constituency, but if you've got shadow responsibilities or ministerial responsibilities, engage with the people who will be affected by the changes you want to make, or the way in which government directs itself, not just in your portfolio but in other areas as well. And the example I give is that as a small business minister, I actually set up a program of actually going out and talking to small business. We just chew the fat, really, talk about the issues as they were affecting them. And from that, we developed the policies that we put in place at the subsequent election, which meant we put in place a Small Business Commissioner. We got complaints from small businesses who said they didn't get paid by government on time. So we put in a regulation that ensured that government departments paid within 30 days, or they had to pay commercial interest rates to those small businesses. And that came not because we thought about it, but listening to the concerns of those small businesses meant we were able to do something about it. And I think that governments and individual members of parliament have to do that on a grander scale. We have to understand the issues that people are living with on a day-to-day basis and engage with them on that level. Because if we don't, the voices we hear are the noisy voices, and they don't represent everyone. The noisy voices are easy to respond to. That's what a lot of governments do. They respond to the noise. You can't afford just to respond to the noise. You have a responsibility to look after those who don't have a voice. And I just want to say, sorry, I just want to say a couple of other things on this. Change comes from all of us making changes. And if we talk about the media, if we talk about how news has become 24/7, it has trivialised the debate that we have around the world about politics. We need to engage in serious debate about the issues we confront. I don't know if governments today would put in place the social security system we have in Australia now if they had the opportunity. I don't know if the kinds of infrastructure that were built during the Great Depression would be built now, because I don't know that there is that confidence within government to do that. I think we need to engage in the debate about the responsibilities of government, the responsibilities of the media, the responsibilities of involving young people in the political process and encouraging them to get involved in being part of the solution, because they're the next generation that have to carry on. Thank you.
Thank you, Marsha. What I'd like to do now is have 5 minutes, just 5 minutes of questioning. Jay and Andrew have to go, and then I will get the other panel, if I may, right up and we can continue. So just 5 minutes of questions, please, sir.
My name's Peter Murran, and I've been following India since 1978, and my first impressions with India was the Indian railway system there, the efficiency of it there, and being able to travel the length and breadth of the land and that. And I've been to India many times, as you know. But my question is about the burgeoning population and the breakup of the states from Bihar, Jharkhand. And when I was in Calcutta at Christmas last year, I was reading a story that they're thinking of breaking up UP into 4 pieces, and the reason behind that is the population, because UP is the largest state of India there. And that I'd like to ask Nadine her views about this there.
Good. Comment on that, and then Jay, perhaps afterwards.
Yeah. Well, personally, I don't think that. I mean, I have an agnostic position on small states. But I think that breaking up states to sort of recognize regional identities to make administrations more efficient is a good thing to think with as to whether that's really going to happen. But it certainly should be a space of debate. And as for the railways, I think that's been one of the best aspects of, I completely agree with you that the railways have been a big source of equality, of connection. I love the railways, so, you know, what do you want to say?
I just wanted to say that I'm also agnostic about breaking up states. I mean, there's been some talk about why not have 50 states instead of 28. Then the argument is why not have 500? That's as many princely states that we used to have. And I'm not sure that it has to be based on population, because every large country or groupings of countries that I can think of, they don't have uniform-sized states. I think it has to have many other factors, not just linguistics, because you have many states in the north of India that actually share languages, but it's not, you know, it's a complex mix of many factors. So I'm sort of open to evolving some kind of a formula, maybe referendums, but, you know, 28 may not be optimal, but very large number also may not be optimal.
No, that's fair enough, I think. No, I'm sorry, sir, but you know, I haven't got much time. Gentleman right back there.
Hi, I'm Arnav Dalai. I'm a student of law here. My question is to the Honourable Member of Parliament. Do you think that the regional parties should preempt the next general elections the same way they did with the presidential elections and try and form an alliance of their own as an alternative that could probably meet the challenges or the regional aspirations, or they should just wait and watch and then either go with one party or the other, which is something which usually happens.
I'm not sure that there is that much consensus across regional parties to be able to have a pre-election understanding. That's always been the shortcoming whenever there is a talk of a third front. Anytime we've had a non-Congress or a non-BJP-led government, it's almost always been a post-election stitching together of a coalition. Perhaps a day will come when that can happen. I'm not sure that the time is ready for that yet.
Good. Thank you. One more question. Sir.
Thanks. We have a very bad system of government in this. Thank you. We have a very bad system of government in Australia, which in 1975 led to the opposition party able to use the Senate to seize power in a coup. Now, the reason for this is apparently that when our constitution was written in 1900, we copied the British 19th century House of Lords power to block supply legislation. They changed this in 1911.
Is the question, sir, or
no,
we get into this area, it's kind of, volatile.
Yeah, my question now is, in India, can your upper house block supply and force an election? And is it elected, and how is it elected? Or is it a modern upper house of review?
I'm sorry, what was the first part? Can it do what?
The Senate, can it block supply and force an election like it can here? No. Can it delay legislation indefinitely, or is it just a house of review?
The answer is no and yes. Let me explain. In our parliamentary system, the government is based entirely on the lower house, having a majority on the lower house. So the upper house cannot pull a government down, and it cannot hold up the budget. But it does have power over every other legislation. And in fact, we have had situations when the government has a minority in the upper house, and that's when they need to have that give and take that I was talking about. Throughout most of the government between 1998 and 2004, the government did not have a majority in the upper house, and yet they managed to pass quite a bit of legislation with working out alliances, sometimes with the opposition. Now, and so they can block every legislation except money bills, but they cannot bring a government down.
No. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. And,